They called this my grave. Tonight it became the only warm room left.
In the winter of 1884, 38 people died in central Montana Territory in the span of 6 days. 11 of them froze inside their own homes. They had firewood stacked outside. They had chimneys. They had walls built by experienced hands, according to every method that experienced hands had agreed upon for 30 years. And they died anyway because the storm that came in January of that year did not negotiate with experience. 5 people survived that storm in a structure that every builder in the territory had looked at and called a mistake. Some had called it worse than that. One man, the most respected carpenter between Lewistown and Fort Benton, had stood at the edge of the excavation on a frozen morning in November of 1882 and told the woman digging it that she was preparing her own grave. Her name was Arabella Dunbar. She was 38 years old, Swedish-born widowed, and she had been in Montana Territory for 8 months when Obadiah Nightingale said those words to her. She did not argue with him. She set the next stone into position and kept working. This is the story of what she built and why it mattered, and what it cost her to build it in a place where no one believed it was possible. Arabella had arrived at Big Spring Creek in April of 1882, traveling west from Minnesota with $70, a cast-iron skillet, a set of carpentry tools that had belonged to her father, and a single piece of knowledge that she had never been able to set down. Her grandfather had built into hillsides in the province of Dalarna in Sweden, cutting living quarters into the slope and building the barn above them, because he understood something that the open-air cabin builders of his generation did not. The earth did not fluctuate. The earth held its temperature the way stone holds the memory of the sun, steady and reliable across the full sweep of winter, indifferent to whatever the sky decided to do above it. Arabella had been 9 years old when her grandfather first explained this to her. He had taken her hand and pressed it flat against the wall of the lower room, the wall that was nothing but packed soil faced with river stones, and he had said that the ground beneath their feet stayed the same temperature every month of the year, regardless of what was happening on the surface. He was not a scientific man. He did not use terms like thermal mass or geothermal stability. He said the earth remembers summer even when winter comes, and if you build inside it instead of on top of it, you borrow that memory. Arabella had remembered this for 29 years. She had filed it away somewhere behind everything that happened afterward, behind her marriage and her move to Minnesota and the years of ordinary life that followed. And then the winter of 1880 came, and her husband, Thomas, got sick, and the cabin they lived in, a perfectly acceptable log structure, built to every standard that Minnesota homesteaders agreed upon, proved itself insufficient for a man whose lungs were already struggling. The cabin was warm enough for a healthy person. It was not warm enough for someone burning through resources just to breathe. Thomas died in February of that year, and Arabella spent the weeks after his burial sitting in the cabin that had not saved him, thinking about what her grandfather had told her about the earth and its memory, and understanding for the first time that she had always known there was a better way to build and had simply never had a reason to use it. She came to Montana because she needed land of her own and because she needed distance from a life that had become a reminder of everything she had failed to do differently. She worked the summer and fall of 1882 for Alonzo Oakenshield, who ran 3,000 head of cattle on the benchlands north of Lewistown and needed a cook for his ranch hands. Oakenshield was 52, weathered from 2 decades of Montana winters, with the kind of eyes that had learned to calculate risk the way other men calculated profit. He paid fairly. He spoke plainly. He did not ask unnecessary questions, which Arabella respected. She spent those months watching. Every morning before the ranch work began, she walked different sections of the land she intended to claim, noting where the wind carved the snow in October, where the water pooled after the autumn rains, which slopes caught the low winter sun, and which stayed in shadow until noon. She dug test holes in 6 different locations, pushing a sharpened rod down into the soil and recording how the temperature changed with depth. She found what she was looking for on the south-facing slope along Big Spring Creek, where bedrock appeared at 17 feet and the natural drainage ran east away from the hillside, following a channel that seasonal melt had been carving for longer than anyone in Montana Territory had been alive. On the last day of September, Oakenshield paid her the final week's wages, and Arabella told him what she intended to build. She described it simply. The living quarters would go into the hillside, cut deep enough that 3 walls would be nothing but earth faced with stone. The fourth wall would face south, built from logs with windows to catch the winter sun. The barn would sit on top its floor, becoming the ceiling of the living space below, and the body heat of the animals overhead would supplement whatever the stove provided. Oakenshield listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had watched 12 women try to homestead alone in this territory, and not one of them had made it past the first winter. Arabella looked at him steadily. Then she said she would be the first. Oakenshield reached into his coat and took out 2 additional weeks of wages and set them on the table between them without explanation. It was the way a man said goodbye to someone he expected not to see again. Arabella picked up the money, thanked him without warmth, and walked out. She filed her claim the following morning when the land office opened, standing at the counter before the clerk had finished his first cup of coffee. She drove her own stakes into the frozen ground at the corners of the quarter section that afternoon, her breath coming in white clouds, her hands steady despite the cold. She began digging in November. The excavation was the hardest sustained physical labor she had ever done, and Arabella had done hard physical labor her entire life. She worked from first light until the cold or the darkness made it impossible to continue breaking frozen ground with a pickaxe and removing the material with a short-handled spade, shoring the walls with timber as she went to prevent collapse. The hole was 12 feet wide and 24 feet deep into the hillside with a level floor of exposed bedrock that she swept clean each morning before beginning the day's work. She cut the structural timber herself. Lodgepole pine felled in October, when the wood was dry, stripped of bark, and stacked to cure through the fall. She notched the joints with the same precision her father had taught her before consumption took him, fitting each piece with the patience of someone who understood that a joint built wrong in November would fail in February, when failure meant something real. She hauled flat stones from the creek bed on a small wooden sled, selecting each one for its ability to lie flat and distribute weight, and position them under the foundation logs with a level she had brought from Minnesota. In December, a wagon arrived with the last of the timber from the mill in White Sulphur Springs. It was driven by Gottfried Richter, 63 years old, a German-born carpenter who had built traditional log cabins across the Dakota Territory for 2 decades before moving west. Obadiah Nightingale rode alongside him, 58 years old, built like someone who had spent his adult life swinging a hammer, with 30 years of Montana winters behind him, and the certainty of a man who had earned his certainty through genuine experience. Nightingale walked the perimeter of the site. He stopped at the excavation and looked down into it. He looked at the timber Arabella had staged, the stone foundation work she had already completed, the careful shoring along the walls. Then he looked at Arabella. He said she was burying herself alive. Arabella waited until he finished, then she explained the design. The living quarters below, she told him. 3 walls of earth, 1 wall of logs facing south. The barn structure above its floor becoming a ceiling, the livestock providing supplemental heat that would descend through the gaps she would leave between the floorboards. A cast iron stove in the northwest corner for the additional heat required. A chimney running up through the barn floor and out the barn roof. The earth at that depth, she told both men, held 47 degrees year-round regardless of surface conditions. She did not need to heat the space from whatever temperature the air happened to be. She needed to heat it from 47 degrees. In a Montana winter, that difference was the distance between possible and impossible. Gottfried Richter set down the load from the wagon and crouched to examine the foundation work. He was quiet for a long time, testing the stone placement, with his hands checking the level of the sill logs, running his eye along the lines of the excavation. Then he straightened. He told Arabella he was concerned about the hillside shifting when the snowmelt came in spring. Arabella had expected this. She walked him to the test holes she had drilled the previous September and showed him the depth readings she had recorded, the bedrock position, the angle of the natural drainage. The water went east, she explained. The spring line was above the structure. She had placed the back wall at the point where the bedrock created a natural anchor. Richter looked at the test records. He looked at the drainage channel. He calculated something in his head that he did not share. Then he told her it might work, but that she was gambling her life on it and that she had family who could take her in if she chose differently. Arabella told him she was staying. Richter did not offer another objection. He finished unloading the timber, exchanged a look with Nightingale that Arabella did not try to interpret, and drove his wagon back toward town. Nightingale remained a moment longer. He stood at the edge of the excavation one more time, looking down into the work she had done and Arabella watched his face and saw the thing that experienced men showed when they encountered something they could not immediately dismiss. It was a not approval. It was a reluctant narrowing of certainty, a small contraction in the confidence he had arrived with. He said nothing. He left. 3 days later, in the short gray afternoon of a December day, Arabella was positioning the foundation stones along the north wall when she heard boots on frozen ground above her. She looked up to find Nightingale's nephew standing at the edge of the excavation, a young man of 22 named Corwin, who had arrived from Pennsylvania 2 weeks earlier with the particular confidence of someone who did not yet know what he did not know. Corwin was not looking where he was stepping. He went over the edge, sideways, catching himself on a shoring timber before he reached the bottom, ending up seated in the excavation with his coat covered in the frozen soil and a startled expression on his face. Arabella looked at him. He was not injured. She threw him the rope she kept coiled near the south wall for exactly this kind of situation, and he climbed out without saying much. When he reached the surface, he stood brushing the dirt from his coat, and then he stopped and looked down into the excavation properly, looking at it as something to be understood rather than as an obstacle he had nearly fallen into. He studied the stone foundation work. He traced the line of the shoring with his eyes. He looked at how the bedrock at the base had been left exposed and swept clean, and how the foundation logs sat directly on the stone rather than on disturbed soil. Then he said it was actually really smart. He said it simply without performance, the way a young man says something true before he has learned to be cautious about what he admits. Arabella looked at him and saw that he meant it. She had not heard that word smart applied to this project by anyone in Lewistown since she had begun. She registered it the way she registered the temperature readings in her notebook, as data useful and precise, stripped of sentiment. What she did not immediately see was that Obadiah Nightingale was standing 10 feet behind his nephew. He had come back to check the progress of the work which he had been doing every few days under the cover of various errands that fooled no one, including himself. He heard what Corwin said. He stood very still. Arabella saw him, see her see him, the small moment of mutual recognition that passed between them. Nightingale did not respond to his nephew's assessment. He did not contradict it. He walked around the perimeter of the site in the way he always did, examining each element of the work with the same deliberate attention he brought every time. And when he left, he walked to his wagon without the commentary he had offered on every previous visit. Arabella watched him go. She understood that silence from a man like Obadiah Nightingale was its own form of information. By mid-January, she had the barn structure framed and the living quarters roughed in beneath it. By February, she was facing the interior walls with flat stones from the creek fitting them tight and pointing the gaps with a mixture of clay and straw that would harden as it dried. The work was slower in the cold. She wore every layer she owned and still had to stop periodically to warm her hands over a small fire she kept burning near the entrance. Some mornings the clay froze before she could work it, and she had to start the fire earlier and wait. Ada Harrowfield came on Sundays as she had promised. She was 41, a widow herself, sharp-eyed and quick-tongued in the way of women who had learned to assess situations quickly because they had no margin for misjudging them. She sold eggs at Calvert's General Store and knew everything that moved through Lewistown before it had finished moving. She arrived each Sunday with a pot of something hot and the week's accumulated intelligence about what people were saying. What people were saying in December and January and February was that Arabella Dunbar had lost her mind, that the structure would collapse in the spring thaw, that a woman alone had no business attempting this kind of excavation, that Nightingale had told her straight and she had refused to listen, which said something about her judgment. Reverend Enoch Fairchild had mentioned from the pulpit, without using her name, that there was a kind of pride that looked like courage, but was in fact a refusal of community, a stubborn isolation that served no one, including the person practicing it. Arabella listened to Ada's reports without visible reaction. She asked specific questions when she had them about the mill schedule, about the glass shipment from Fort Benton, about whether the Richter family had had any more chimney problems. She did not ask what people thought of her. One Sunday in late January, Ada set the pot down on the flat stone Arabella used as a table and looked at her for a moment before speaking. She said the men in town were not just doubting the structure anymore. They were waiting for it to fail. There was a difference, Ada said, between people who thought she was wrong and people who needed her to be wrong, and Lewistown currently had a good number of the second kind. If Arabella failed, it would settle something for them, and if she succeeded, it would unsettle something else entirely. Arabella stood with her hands wrapped around the cup of coffee Ada had poured and considered this. Then she said she would not fail. Ada looked at her with the expression of someone who has just heard a person say something that is both completely true and completely beside the point. She reached over and squeezed Arabella's arm once hard, the way you held on to something you were not sure you would see again. Then she picked up the empty pot and walked back through the snow to her wagon. After she left Isharium, Arabella stood in the half-finished interior of the living quarters she had been carving out of the Montana hillside for 3 months. The walls were stone-faced on 3 sides and rough-framed timber on the south. The ceiling was the underside of the barn floor she had built above 8 inches of lodgepole pine over 2-inch gaps that she had left deliberately to let the warmth of the animals descend. The stove sat in the northwest corner, not yet connected to the chimney, which she would finish in March. The space was small, 16 feet by 20 feet of actual living area, 7 feet of ceiling height low enough to hold whatever warmth the stove and the earth and the animals above could provide, tall enough for a person to move through without stooping. She had planned every dimension with a specific purpose, and every dimension was exactly what she had intended. She looked at the space and she knew it was right. She could feel the relative warmth of it, even without the stove burning, the way the earth held the temperature it had accumulated over the previous summer and released it slowly and steadily into the enclosed space she had built around it. And in the stillness of that Sunday afternoon, with Ada's wagon already disappearing toward the road, Arabella felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since arriving in Montana. Not doubt, not fear, something more precise and more difficult than either of those things. She felt how alone she was, not in the practical sense which she had long since made her peace with, but in the specific sense of having no one to whom she could say, "I think this is going to work." Not to persuade them, not for their approval, simply to have the thought exist somewhere outside herself in the shared air, between 2 people who both understood what was at stake. She thought about her husband Thomas in moments like this. Not with grief exactly, which had moved through its recognizable stages and settled into something quieter, but with the particular awareness of what his presence would have meant in this specific context. Thomas had been a careful man, methodical in his thinking, the kind of person who asked good questions rather than offering quick reassurances. He would have understood what she was doing here. He would have sat with her in the half-finished room and looked at the stone facing on the walls and asked about the pointing mix and whether she was satisfied with the drainage calculations, and his questions would have been exactly the kind that made her thinking sharper. She missed that, not the warmth of companionship in the general sense, which Ada provided adequately on Sundays, but the specific intellectual companionship of someone who engaged with what she was doing rather than simply witnessing it. She had built this structure to hold heat. She had calculated the dimensions and sourced the materials and done the labor and made every decision herself, and the decisions had been correct, and she was going to be warm this winter, while other people burned through their wood supplies and prayed for the cold to break. All of that was true, but there was no one to sit in the warm room with her and know that it was real. She picked up her tools and went back to work. By mid-March, the living quarters were complete. The cast iron stove was set and connected to the chimney, which ran up through the barn floor and out the barn roof in a clean vertical line that she had designed to minimize creosote accumulation. The 2 glass windows she had ordered from Fort Benton, the single most expensive purchase she had made since arriving in Montana, were set into the south-facing log wall in frames she had built herself, sealed with linseed oil putty that would need replacing every 3 years. A covered porch extended from the south-facing door, angled to deflect the prevailing northwest wind and designed to stay clear of drifts. Alonzo Oakenshield arrived at the end of March with the 2 oxen and 3 milk cows she had contracted to buy on credit, the terms of repayment tied to the first 3 years of calves. He brought Corwin Nightingale with him to help with the delivery, which Arabella had not expected. Oakenshield walked through the barn first. He examined the hay storage along the east wall, the grain bins, the way she had positioned the animals to maximize the heat distribution toward the center of the floor. He looked at the floor joists and found the deliberate gaps she had left. He knelt and put his hand over one of the gaps and felt the warmth rising from below. He said nothing and came down the exterior stairs she had cut into the hillside on the south side, and Arabella opened the door and let him into the living quarters. He stopped 2 steps inside. He stood there in his heavy coat, with his hat in his hand, and felt the temperature of the room settle around him. Outside, it was 29 degrees. In the room, it was 63. Arabella had been keeping daily records in a cloth-bound notebook since the stove was first lit, and the numbers had not varied by more than 4 degrees across the 2 weeks of operation she had logged. Oakenshield touched the stone-faced wall. It was cool but not cold, dry, solid. He asked how much wood she was burning each day. She told him 40 pounds in March. In January, when she had been running the stove during the worst of the cold, it had been closer to 70. He stood with this information, and she watched him do the arithmetic. A traditional cabin of this size in Montana Territory burned through somewhere between 6,000 and 6,500 pounds of wood across a full winter. Arabella's structure at its heaviest consumption would use less than half that, probably closer to a third. Oakenshield looked at her. He asked if she was worried about something. Arabella told him she was always worried about something, but that she wanted to know what she was preparing for. She asked him to tell her about the worst winter he had seen in 11 years of ranching the benchlands. Oakenshield set his hat on the edge of the stone windowsill. He told her about February of 1875. A 3-day blow. The temperature dropped to 38 below. The wind was strong enough to carry frozen cattle off their feet. They lost 900 head in that storm. 3 people in town froze in their own cabins when they ran out of wood and could not reach their outbuildings to get more. He looked at her barn at the hillside at the work she had done. Then he said she was preparing right, that was more than most could say, and he put his hat back on and walked out to get the animals settled. Arabella stood in the room after he left. 63 degrees. The stove had not been lit since early morning. The earth held the temperature and would hold it for another 6 or 7 hours before she would need to add wood again. She had been right. She had known she was right 4 months in the way you know something, when every measurement confirms it and every calculation supports it. But the knowing had been a solitary thing locked inside her notebooks and her daily measurements, and her memory of her grandfather pressing her hand against a stone wall in Sweden and telling her that the earth remembers summer. Oakenshield's acknowledgement changed nothing about the technical reality. The structure was exactly what it had always been. But Arabella sat down on the edge of the bed platform she had built along the east wall and felt the warm air move around her, and thought about Thomas, about the Minnesota winter, about the room that had been sufficient for a healthy person and insufficient for someone who needed more than sufficiency. She had built this room so that more than sufficiency was the baseline, so that even the worst case started from a position of warmth. She had done what she came here to do. She was still sitting there when Corwin Nightingale appeared in the doorway, having settled the animals with Oakenshield and come to find her. He looked around the room with the unhurried attention he had shown at the excavation 2 months earlier, the attention of someone young enough to still be genuinely curious about how things worked. He asked how long she had been working on this. She said 10 months from the first test hole to moving in. She had worked alone except for the timber delivery. Corwin was quiet. Then he said his uncle had told him on the ride out that Arabella Dunbar was the most stubborn person in the Judith Basin, and that stubbornness in a woman was generally a problem. Arabella waited. Corwin said he thought his uncle was wrong about the problem part. He said it carefully, the way a 22-year-old from Pennsylvania says something that feels important when he is not entirely sure of the terrain. Then he pulled out a small notebook of his own and asked if she would mind if he recorded a few of the dimensions, because he had been thinking about filing his own claim, and he wanted to understand the design properly before he committed to anything. Arabella looked at him for a moment. Then she moved to the south wall and pointed to the window framing and began to explain. That evening, after Oakenshield and Corwin had ridden back toward town, Arabella built up the stove for the last stoking of the day and sat with her notebook in the lamplight, recording the temperature, the wood consumption, the wind direction, the cloud cover. She had done this every evening for 2 weeks, and she would continue to do it for 20 years, until the record she left behind would become one of the most detailed accounts of earth-sheltered thermal performance in the historical archives of the state of Montana. Outside, the temperature was dropping towards single digits. The wind had come up from the northwest, carrying the first serious cold of the spring season back across the territory, like a reminder that the season was not finished with anyone yet. Inside the room, the temperature held at 61 degrees. Arabella closed her notebook and listened to the wind and thought about what Alonzo Oakenshield had said about February of 1875 about cattle carried off their feet, and 3 people frozen in their own homes with firewood in their sheds. She thought about the storm that was still coming. The one Oakenshield's bones were already predicting the one she was building toward, with every cord of wood she stacked, and every gap she sealed, and every number she recorded in her careful hand. She did not know yet that it would come in January of 1884. She did not know yet that it would last 6 days, or that the temperature would reach 41 below, or that 5 people would knock on her door at 10:30 on the first night, and that their survival would depend entirely on the decision she had made 2 years earlier to dig into a hillside that every experienced person in the territory had told her would be her grave. She knew only what the numbers told her, and the numbers were good, and outside the wind was rising, and inside the room the warmth held steady, the earth keeping its long, slow promise to everyone willing to trust it. The girl's breathing was the first thing Arabella heard when she opened the door. Not the wind, not Gottfried Richter's voice explaining what had happened to their chimney. The breathing. A wet, labored sound coming from somewhere inside the bundle of blankets Elfrida Richter was holding against her chest, a sound that Arabella recognized before she had time to think about recognizing it. She had heard it once before in a cabin in Minnesota, and she had listened to it change and slow over the course of 3 weeks until it stopped. She stepped back and held the door wide. "Bring her in," Arabella said. "How long has she had the fever?" 4 days, Gottfried told her. "Getting worse." Arabella had the bed cleared and the extra blankets down from the shelf before Elfrida had finished crossing the room. Gretel Richter was 17 years old, and she weighed almost nothing in her mother's arms. Her skin was the particular color of fever, a dull reddish heat that told Arabella the body was working harder than it could sustain. Her lips were dry. Her eyes, when they opened briefly, did not focus on anything. Gottfried stood near the door with his hat in both hands, his face arranged into the careful stillness of a man trying not to show his wife how frightened he was. He explained about the crack in the chimney flue, the smoke that had filled the cabin before they understood what was happening, the 3 hours in the cold air outside while he tried to assess the damage. By the time he understood the repair would take days, Gretel's condition had already changed. Arabella sent him to sleep in the barn with instructions to start on the chimney repair, at first light regardless of the temperature. She set water to boil. She found the willow bark she had dried and stored in labeled cloth pouches along the north wall, measured a portion into a small pot, and began making the tea that would work on the fever the same way it had worked for her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother, slowly and without drama, coaxing the body back from the edge rather than forcing it. Elfrida Richter sat in the chair beside the bed and held her daughter's hand and did not speak. Arabella moved around the small room with the efficiency of someone performing a procedure she had prepared for without knowing she was preparing for it. The mustard and camphor mixture for the chest, the damp cloth for the forehead, the careful cracking of the south-facing door just 2 inches, just enough to exchange the air without dropping the temperature more than the stove could recover. The room stayed at 60 degrees. Outside it was 12 below. On the second night, Elfrida fell asleep in the chair with her head tipped against the wall, and Arabella sat alone beside Gretel and listened to the girl breathe. The sound was still wrong, still that wet, labored quality that meant the lungs were working against themselves, but it had not worsened since they arrived, which Arabella took as the first piece of good news. She opened her notebook and wrote the temperature reading. Then she sat with the pen in her hand and did not write anything else for a long time. She was thinking about Thomas, not the way she usually thought about him, which was in the practical terms of what his death had changed and what it had required her to become. She was thinking about the specific sound of his breathing in their Minnesota cabin during the last 2 weeks of his life, and how she had sat beside him in the same posture she was sitting in now, and how the room had been exactly as warm as a properly built log cabin could be made, and how it had not been enough. She had built this room so that enough would not be the ceiling. She had calculated and dug and hauled stone and set timber with the specific intention of creating a space where the baseline was something more than sufficient, where even if everything else went wrong, there would be warmth to spare. She had done this for reasons she had never explained to anyone, not to Oakenshield, not to Ada, not to Richter, when he questioned her drainage calculations. She looked at Gretel's face in the lamplight. The fever color was still there, but the girl's breathing had found a slightly steadier rhythm in the past hour. Arabella wrote in her notebook, "I built this place so no one would have to count someone else's breaths in the cold." She did not write anything else. She put the notebook away and kept her watch. On the ninth day, Gretel sat up and asked for water in a voice that was thin but present. Elfrida made a sound that was not quite a word. Arabella filled a cup and handed it across without comment, but she stood at the stove with her back to the room for a moment before she turned around, and anyone who had been watching her face would have seen something move through it that she did not have a name for. The morning Gottfried arrived to take his family home, he walked through the living quarters one final time. He examined the wall construction, the ceiling, the way the stove sat in relation to the air movement through the room. He was a carpenter and he could not help assessing the work even in a moment that was not about the work. He found nothing to criticize. His earlier objection about the drainage had proved wrong. The spring thaw had come and gone, exactly as Arabella predicted, the water channeling east along the natural grade without touching the structure. He stood at the door with his hat on and looked at Arabella and said that he had told her it might work back in December of 1882, but that he had not believed it when he said it. He said he was saying it now because it was true and he owed her that. Arabella nodded once. Elfrida took her hands before she climbed onto the wagon. She said that Gretel would have died in their cabin, that even with a repaired chimney, the cold that winter had been beyond what the structure could hold against. She said this place holds warmth like a mother holds a child, and Arabella did not have an answer for that, so she held Elfrida's hands for a moment and let go. She watched the wagon until it disappeared around the curve of the creek road. Then she went inside and sat down at the table and was still for a while in the way that people are still when something has resolved itself but left a space behind. 3 days later, Reverend Enoch Fairchild came. He did not come about Gretel. He came in the late afternoon, tying his horse at the post outside with the deliberate motions of a man who has rehearsed what he intends to say, and Arabella offered him coffee and waited. He accepted the coffee. He looked around the room, which he had not been inside before. He registered the temperature the way everyone did, with a small, involuntary adjustment of expression, the body acknowledging what the mind was still processing. Then he set down his cup and told Arabella that people were talking. She waited. He said a woman alone taking in other men's families through the night repeatedly was not a situation that looked right to the community. He said he understood the circumstances had been genuine. He was not questioning her intentions. But appearances had weight in a town like Lewistown, and Arabella had already made herself unusual in ways that required careful management, and she should not give people additional reasons to question her judgment. Arabella looked at him across the table. She said she would stop worrying about appearances when appearances stopped people from dying. Reverend Fairchild set down his cup with more care than was necessary. He told her that was a very confident position for a woman in her situation. Arabella said she was confident because she had data. She had 16 months of temperature records, a girl who was alive because the room held 60 degrees when the air outside was 12 below, and a structure that every experienced builder in the territory had called a mistake, and that had not made a single mistake yet. She said she was open to being told what she had gotten wrong, but that she would need specifics. Fairchild did not have specifics. He had concerns which were different from evidence, and Arabella had learned early in her life that concerns without evidence were the primary currency of people who needed things to stay the same. He left without finishing his coffee. Arabella cleared the cups and washed them and stood at the south window looking out at the late afternoon light moving across the snow on the bench land. She was not angry. She had moved through anger about Fairchild's kind of opposition sometime in the fall of 1882 and had not gone back to it. What she felt now was something more specific and harder to dismiss, a fatigue that had nothing to do with the physical work of the past year and a half. She had been right about the drainage and right about the thermal mass and right about the structural load and right about the spring thaw and right about the wood consumption and right about what it would take to keep a sick girl alive through a December cold snap. She had been right about all of it. And the community's primary concern was still how it looked. The distinction Ada had drawn for her in January of the previous year came back to her now with new precision. There were people who thought she was wrong, and there were people who needed her to be wrong. Fairchild was not quite either of those things. He was something more complicated, a man who needed her to be manageable, and she had proven herself to be something else entirely. She understood, standing at that window, that being correct about the technology was not the same as being accepted as the person who was correct. The distance between those two things was something she did not yet know how to cross. Summer came and proved everything that needed proving on the physical side. The 60 acres she planted in wheat produced 37 bushels per acre, which was good land by any measure in the Judith Basin. She rendered tallow from a steer. Oakenshield gave her in exchange for 2 weeks of consultation on his North Range shacks, made 42 candles, stored them in the coolest section of the rear room, where the temperature held at 49 degrees through the warmest months. She spent September sealing every gap and joint she could find, working from the roof down, applying a second layer of tar paper to the barn roof in the last week of the month before the first hard frost. In October, Obadiah Nightingale came back. He came without the cover of a delivery or an errand. He tied his horse at the post and walked to the door and knocked, and when Arabella opened it, he was standing with his hat in both hands and an expression she had not seen on his face before. He asked if she would walk his nephew through the design. Corwin was filing his own claim, Nightingale said, and he wanted the boy to build it right. Arabella looked at this man who had stood at the edge of her excavation and told her she was preparing her own grave. She looked at him, holding his hat in his hands, asking her for the knowledge he had told her was worthless. She said, "Come in." She did not require him to acknowledge what he had said to her. She did not mention it. She poured coffee and found her notebook and spent 2 hours walking Corwin through every dimension and decision: the depth of the excavation, the angle of the south wall, the spacing of the floor, joists, the chimney configuration, and the damper system. Corwin recorded everything in his own notebook with the careful attention of a young man who understood he was learning something that could not be found in any manual. Nightingale sat in the chair near the stove and listened without speaking. Arabella was aware of him the entire time, the way you are aware of something that has changed its position relative to you, even if you cannot see it directly. When Corwin asked a question, she answered it, and when Nightingale shifted in his chair, she did not look at him. But near the end, when Corwin had put away his notebook and was asking about the specific stone she had used for the interior facing, Arabella glanced at Obadiah Nightingale and saw that he was watching her with the expression of a man who is in the process of revising something he has held for a long time. He did not say anything that afternoon. He did not need to. Arabella understood that his presence in the chair in the room he had predicted would collapse, asking her to teach his nephew what she knew was its own form of statement. Some things did not require words to be clear. On the 23rd of January, 1884, Alonzo Oakenshield rode up at noon on a horse that was moving with the nervous energy of an animal that could smell what was coming. He told her the barometer was dropping faster than he had seen it drop in 11 years. He told her not to go outside once the storm hit, not for animals, not for wood, not for anything. He told her to check her supplies and her wood and her water, and then stay inside until it was over. Arabella told him she had 3 cords in the barn and another cord in the quarters. She told him she had food for 10 days if she was careful. He looked at her for a long moment before he left. He said to send word when it cleared. Arabella told him to keep himself and his people safe. Oakenshield nodded and turned his horse and was gone down the creek road in the direction of his own preparations. The storm arrived at dusk. Arabella watched it come from the south window, a wall of white advancing across the benchland from the northwest with the deliberate inevitability of something that had been building itself for days over ground she could not see. The temperature had been dropping since early afternoon. Her outdoor thermometer read 8 degrees at 4 o'clock. At 5, it read -2. By 6, the wind had arrived. She had heard wind before. Montana wind in winter was not a subtle thing, and she had been listening to it for 2 years. But this was different from anything she had heard. This was not gusting, not rising and falling in the normal rhythms of a moving weather system. This was continuous, a single unbroken roar that pressed against the barn walls above her and found every gap and crack and sang through it at a pitch that occupied the space between hearing and feeling. The barn shuddered in a way that she had not felt it shudder before, a deep lateral flexion in the structure that told her the wind was hitting the north wall with a sustained force rather than impulses. She had built the barn for this. The diagonal bracing, the connection points, she had doubled on the north-facing wall the way the roof load transferred to the hillside through the anchor beams she had sunk into the bedrock on the uphill side. She had built all of it, knowing that a Montana barn would eventually meet a Montana storm, and that the meeting would be the test. She fed the stove, checked the temperature reading in her notebook, and settled in. At 10:30, she heard the knock. She opened the door, and the cold hit her like a physical weight, a pressure rather than a temperature, and in the yellow rectangle of lamplight, she saw Reverend Fairchild on the covered porch, so covered in snow and ice that for a moment she did not recognize him. He was barely standing. His hands were shaking in the way hands shake when the body has stopped, being able to generate heat faster than it is losing it. Behind him were three more figures emerging from the white. Ada Harrowfield with Roy pressed against her side, the boy's face turned into his mother's coat. Corwin Nightingale carrying something. Arabella looked and understood that what Corwin was carrying was the boy that Roy could not walk, that his feet were wrong. Fairchild said our cabins. He said the wind took Ada's roof. He said his own structure was filling with snow through cracks he had not known existed. He said Corwin's place had split along the main wall join. He said they had seen her light. He said, please. Arabella had the door all the way open before he finished the word. She got Ada and Roy nearest the stove. She found every blanket she owned and distributed them. She put water on to heat and located the dry clothing she had in the chest along the east wall, which was not much, but was dry, which was what mattered. Fairchild was coherent enough to be frightened, which meant his core temperature had not dropped past the threshold where judgment failed, and Arabella took that as her second piece of good information in the same hour. Roy's hands were the problem. The fingers of his right hand were a color that Arabella had learned to read accurately from 2 years of Montana winters. She sat the boy down near the stove, not too close, and worked his hands carefully and deliberately in the way that preserved the tissue rather than damaging it further. He made small sounds but did not cry. He was 9 years old and he was trying very hard to be something other than what he was, which was a child who was frightened and in pain in a stranger's room, while the world outside made sounds that had no human equivalent. Arabella talked to him while she worked his hands. She told him about the barn above them and the 3 cows and the 2 oxen, all of them warm and unhappy about the noise, but safe inside the structure she had built to hold them. She told him the animals' names. She told him one of the cows had a calf coming in April, and that if he wanted, he could come back then and see it. He stopped making sounds and listened to her. By midnight, the temperature outside had reached -38 and was still dropping. The room held 63 degrees with the stove burning at the rate Arabella had calculated she could sustain for 6 days without running short. 5 people instead of 1 meant more body heat generated, which offset some of the additional cold transfers from the door openings. It also meant more air consumed, more food required, more coordination of the small logistics that kept 5 people functional in a 16 by 20-foot space. Arabella had already begun the calculations in her head. On the first full day, the temperature outside reached -41. The wind did not vary. It was not a storm in the way Arabella had come to understand storms, with shifts and lulls, and the structural changes that meant the system was moving. This was static. This was the air itself having made a decision. On the second day, something broke in the barn above them. A crack that transmitted through the ceiling into the room as a sharp concussive sound, followed by the long bellowing of frightened cattle. Corwin stood up before the echo had finished. Arabella told him to sit down. She said if he went up there, he would not come back down. She said the barn would hold or it would not, and going up there would not change which of those things was true. He sat down. The barn held. On the third day, the wind dropped briefly, just long enough that the constant pressure on Arabella's hearing eased, and she became aware of how much of her energy had been going toward maintaining ordinary function against the relentless noise. Corwin stood at the south window and said that the worst was probably over, that they should think about making a run for town while the weather had softened. Arabella went to the window and looked out. The snow had drifted against the north side of the barn to a depth she estimated at 11 feet. The terrain she had walked every day for 2 years was gone. There were shapes out there, hills and hollows created by the drifts, but none of them corresponded to anything she recognized. She said, "We stay." Corwin did not argue. He had heard what she said about the barn on the second day and had watched her be right, and he was young enough and intelligent enough to update his assessments on the basis of evidence. On the fourth day, Ada began to cry. She cried without the kind of self-consciousness that people apply to crying in public, which told Arabella that she had gone past the point where performance was possible. Everything she owned was gone. Her house was gone. Her husband had been dead for 2 years, and what she had built in the time since his death, the small, careful accumulation of a woman making do, was buried under 11 feet of snow or scattered across the territory by a wind that did not distinguish between what a person needed and what it wanted to take. Roy tried to comfort her. He was 9 and he did his best, and his best was sincere, and it was not enough. And he knew it was not enough. And that knowledge was visible on his face in a way that Arabella found harder to watch than Ada's crying. Reverend Fairchild led them in a prayer that evening. His voice was steadier than it had been since he arrived, which Arabella attributed partly to recovery and partly to the fact that having a clear role restored something to him that the helplessness of the previous days had taken away. He prayed for the people outside, for the families in their cabins, and the ranchers on their ranges, and the travelers who might have been caught in the open, and his voice carried the genuine weight of a man who understood that some of those prayers were arriving too late for the people they were meant for. Arabella bowed her head with the others. She did not pray herself, but she understood the value of the ritual for people who needed a way to acknowledge that the situation was larger than any of them could manage alone. Corwin told stories about Pennsylvania afterward, about Philadelphia in summer, about the particular irrelevance of snow in a city where snow was an inconvenience rather than a sentence. He described the market at Reading Terminal and the smell of coffee from the vendors and the way the city absorbed weather rather than being defined by it. And Arabella could see from Roy's face that the boy was using these stories as a kind of shelter building, a mental image of a place where children did not have to count the remaining wood in the pile and calculate how many days it would last. Arabella fed the stove and portioned the food and monitored the temperature and said very little. She had learned early in this ordeal that her primary function was not comfort, but management, and that the most useful thing she could do for the 4 people sharing her space was to keep the practical details under control so that they had room to manage their own fear without also managing the logistics of survival. That night, after the others had settled into whatever sleep was available to them, Ada was still awake. Arabella was in the chair near the stove, keeping the half-dozing watch she had established as her nighttime practice. The lamp was turned down low. The stove ticked and breathed. Outside, the wind continued its work. Ada asked quietly if Arabella had ever been afraid when she was building this place. Arabella looked at her. Ada said she meant really afraid, not worried about the technical questions, afraid that she had made a mistake that was too large to recover from. Arabella was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked. The wind pressed against the barn walls above them. She said every single day. Ada said, then how did you keep going? Arabella said being afraid was not a reason to stop. It was information. It told her what needed more attention, what calculations needed to be checked again, what assumptions needed to be tested rather than trusted. She said that fear had made the structure better because she had not been able to afford to let it make her stop. Ada looked around the room, at Roy asleep with his hands wrapped in fresh cloth near the stove, at the stone-faced walls that had not moved in 3 days of a wind that was taking apart every above-ground structure in the territory. She said your information was right. Arabella looked at her. In the low lamplight, Ada's face had the quality of someone who has arrived at a truth by a route that cost her considerably, and Arabella felt something shift in the room between them. Not the temperature, which was steady, but something else, something she did not have a technical term for. She had built this room so that the baseline was warmth. She had built it so that even the worst case started from a position of sufficiency rather than desperate maintenance. She had built it because of Thomas, because of what she had not been able to give him in a Minnesota cabin that met every standard and missed the point. Sitting across from Ada in the lamplight with Roy's hands healing near the stove and the storm still working outside and the earth holding its temperature around them, as it had held it for every winter since before any European had set foot in this territory, Arabella understood that she had done what she had come here to do. Not the proving, not the vindication of the design against the doubts of experienced men. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. She had built a room where people who had nowhere else to go could be warm. She had not known that was what she was building. But there it was. On the 5th day, they ran out of meat. Arabella made flatbread on the stovetop and boiled the remaining potatoes and served the result in portions calibrated to keep 5 people functional without depleting the reserves she needed to hold in case the storm extended past the window she had calculated. Nobody complained. Corwin ate his portion and asked if there was anything useful he could do, and Arabella gave him the task of splitting the remaining interior wood into smaller pieces to extend the burn time, which occupied him for most of the afternoon and was not strictly necessary but was necessary in a different way. On the 6th day at 3 in the morning, the wind stopped. Arabella woke from her chair at the silence. It took her a moment to understand what she was hearing, which was nothing, which was the complete absence of the sound that had been the constant condition of the past 6 days. Reverend Fairchild was awake across the room, watching the ceiling. "It is over," he said quietly. Arabella stood up and put on her coat. She opened the door and the cold hit her at 29 degrees, which felt mild by comparison with what the thermometer had been showing. And above her, the sky was clear and black, and the stars were the particular intense brightnesses of very cold air from which every particle of moisture has been removed. The snow had built itself into formations she had no prior reference for. Frozen waves 8 and 10 feet high, surfaces scoured clean and redeposited according to a logic she would need time to trace. To the south, in the direction from which she should have been able to see 3 miles of benchland, there was only the featureless white plateau of a drift that had built itself against the barn's south face. She stood for a moment in the absolute quiet of the aftermath. Then she turned back to the door. "Morning," she said into the darkness of the room. "We dig out." It took 3 hours. All 5 of them working moving snow with the 2 shovels Arabella owned and the wooden scoop she had made for clearing the barn entrance, cutting a path from the south-facing door to open ground, and then extending it to the surface level of the surrounding terrain. When they finally stepped up onto the surface of the snowpack and looked around at the world the storm had remade, Arabella saw Corwin's face change. His building was gone, not damaged, not partially collapsed. The structure he had been living in, a modest single-room affair he had constructed himself in the fall, was gone from the landscape as completely as if it had never existed. There were pieces of it distributed across the snowfield to the northeast, following the direction of the windboards, and fragments of timber, half buried and scattered across 200 yards of open ground. Reverend Fairchild's church had lost its north wall and most of its roof. The Richter cabin, 3 miles east, visible as a dark shape against the white, had something wrong with its profile that Arabella read as partial collapse. She looked at all of it and then looked back at the barn above her, which was standing. The north wall had a section that had been pushed inward by the accumulated snow load, and she would need to assess the structural damage to the upper framing, but it was standing. Beneath it, the living quarters were as she had left them, the temperature reading in her notebook not having deviated by more than 3 degrees across the entire 6-day event. Alonzo Oakenshield arrived on horseback at noon, leading 2 spare horses, and pulled up short when he saw all 5 of them standing outside in the thin winter sunlight. He sat on his horse and looked at them for a long moment. Then he told them 38 people had died in the storm. 11 of them had frozen in their own homes with wood available, with structures that met every standard anyone in the territory had agreed upon. The rest were ranchers and homesteaders caught outside or in buildings that could not hold against what the storm had brought. He looked at Arabella. He said, "You know what you have built here?" Arabella said, "A cabin." Oakenshield looked at the hillside, at the earth berm, at the south-facing wall with its glass windows intact, at the 5 people standing alive in the January sunlight. He said, "A solution." Then he turned his horse to lead them toward town and paused and looked back at Arabella. He asked if she would be willing to show others how she had done this. He said quietly, without drama, that he thought people needed to know. Arabella looked at the 4 people beside her, at Roy's hands healing, at Ada's face, which had something in it now that had not been there before the storm, at Corwin, who was standing very still, looking at the place where his building used to be, learning in real time what the difference was between a structure and a solution. She said yes. The first man arrived with a notebook on a Tuesday. Gottfried Richter came alone, without his wife, without his wagon. He tied his horse at the post and knocked, and when Arabella let him in, he sat down at the table and opened the notebook to the first page and set his pencil on the edge and said he wanted to understand the foundation work properly. Not the general principle, the specific dimensions, the exact depth of the bedrock anchor on the uphill side and the precise angle of the south wall base and the spacing of the cross bracing in the barn floor above. Arabella made coffee and sat across from him and answered every question. He came back the following Tuesday with 2 neighbors, a rancher named Harlan Underhill and a younger man who had filed a claim the previous fall and was trying to decide whether to tear down what he had already built and start over. They brought their own notebooks. Arabella answered their questions and walked them through the temperature records she had kept since March of 1883, 22 months of daily readings that documented what the structure had done across 2 full winters, 1 ordinary, and 1 that had killed 38 people across the territory. The numbers did not require interpretation. Interior temperatures holding at 63 degrees while outside air dropped to -14. A daily low of 58 during the worst night of the January storm, achieved with a stove that had been banked for 4 hours. Wood consumption for the entire winter, including 6 days of 5-person occupancy running to less than half what a standard log structure of equivalent size required. Harlan Underhill studied those figures for a long time. Then he asked Arabella if he could copy them into his own notebook, and she said yes. By the third week, there were 7 people at the Tuesday sessions. By the fourth week, 11. Arabella had not designed the sessions. She had simply answered the door when people knocked and answered questions when people asked them. But the pattern had established itself without anyone deciding to establish it the way water finds a channel, not because anyone planned the route, but because the route was there. She observed something during these sessions that she had not anticipated. The people who came were not only builders and ranchers. There were women among them, homesteaders' wives, who had heard from their husbands about the sessions and arrived the following week with their own questions. Quieter questions about the root cellar design and the ventilation approach, and how to preserve the clay pointing on the interior walls. Arabella answered every question the same way, regardless of who asked it, completely and without condescension, and she noticed that the women took more thorough notes than the men. Obadiah Nightingale brought Corwin back in the first week of February, 4 weeks after the storm. Corwin had been staying with his uncle while filing an amended claim on a parcel 4 miles west, a piece of ground he had selected specifically because the south-facing slope shared the same general character as Arabella's site. He came with his notebook from the previous visit already filled, and a new one started, and spent 2 hours working through the specific problem of his location, which had bedrock appearing at a shallower depth and would require adjustments to the foundation design. Arabella looked at his survey notes and his test hole records. She told him the shallower bedrock was actually an advantage in terms of anchor stability, and that the main adjustment would be to the interior ceiling height, which he could recover by extending the barn structure upward without changing the thermal behavior of the living space below. Corwin wrote everything down. Then he looked up and said that his uncle had described Arabella Dunbar on the drive out to the first visit as the most stubborn person in the Judith Basin. Arabella waited. Corwin said he had come to think stubbornness was the wrong word. Stubbornness meant refusing to be corrected. What Arabella had was different. She was willing to be corrected by evidence. She simply was not willing to be corrected by opinion. Arabella looked at him for a moment. She said that was a useful distinction. Corwin nodded and closed his notebook and went out to help with the horses. Obadiah Nightingale had not come inside. He had been at the barn examining the section of north wall that the January storm had pushed inward, running his hand along the damaged framing with the attention of a man who cannot look at a structure without reading it. Arabella went out when Corwin was occupied. Nightingale was crouching at the corner where the push damage was worse, looking at the connection between the buckled section and the anchor beams. When he straightened and found her standing behind him, something moved through his face that she read carefully. Not embarrassment, something more deliberate. He said the damage was repairable. The primary load path had held. The push had buckled the secondary framing, but the anchor had not moved, and the repair would not require work below the floor line. Arabella said she knew. He looked at the wall for another moment. Then he said he had built 17 structures in Montana territory, and not one of them had come through the January storm without significant damage. 3 of his own buildings had been total losses. Arabella waited. He said he had been wrong about her design. He said it plainly, without decoration, in the manner of a man who has thought about something until he is certain of it and is not going to spend additional words on the approach. Arabella looked at the damaged section, at the place where the wall had been inward under the accumulated weight and the structure behind it had held anyway. She said she appreciated him saying so. Nightingale nodded once and went to find his nephew. Arabella stood for a while in the cold outside the barn, looking at the repair work she would schedule for spring, thinking about what it would require and what she would learn from doing it that she did not already know. The news moved the way that genuinely useful information moves through a community that has recently been frightened. A surveyor from Fort Benton came in March and walked the full length of the drainage system Arabella had designed along the creek side of the property. He made detailed notes and told her it was the most considered water management he had seen in a homestead structure in 15 years of working in the territory. He asked who had trained her as an engineer. She said her grandfather mostly, and the land itself. He wrote something in his notes and thanked her for her time. A builder from Great Falls arrived in April with a client planning construction in the Rockies. He measured the temperature differential on a morning when the outside registered 6 degrees and found the living quarters at 48 without the stove having been lit since the previous evening. He spent an hour making careful sketches and then told Arabella she could charge substantial fees for this knowledge. Arabella asked what would happen to homesteaders who could not afford his rates once he had acquired the right to sell her design. He said that was a business problem, not hers. Arabella said it was exactly hers. She told him to use the design freely, share it, teach it to anyone who needed it, and to build it correctly when he did. He left without the arrangement he had come for. Ida reported afterward that he had told people in Lewistown Arabella had no head for business. Arabella said good, if he believed that he would not return to try to buy something that was not for sale. Ada poured coffee and said Arabella was the most inconveniently principled person she had ever known. Arabella said she was fairly sure that was a compliment. Ada said it was, and outside the April light was moving across the benchland in the long angles of a Montana spring that had finally decided to stay. In April, she found the letter. She had not been looking for it. She was reorganizing the storage chest along the east wall, and it was at the bottom under a folded wool blanket still sealed. Her sister Solveig had sent it from Chicago in November of 1883, and Arabella had not opened it because she had known what it would say and had not been ready to respond to it. She sat on the edge of the bed platform and broke the seal. Solveig wrote that Arabella had proven her point. She had survived a winter and helped some neighbors, and that was admirable, and everyone in the family was glad she was safe. But she had proven what she needed to prove, and there was no shame in coming home now. There was work in the stockyard district. There were respectable Swedish families in Chicago who would welcome her. A woman of 38 still had time to build a different kind of life. Solveig asked her to please consider it. Arabella read the letter twice. She looked at the room around her, at the stone-faced walls and the stove in the northwest corner, and the 2 glass windows and the temperature notebook, and the 22 months of daily records stacked in the chest. She got out paper and wrote back for the first time in more than a year. She wrote, "Dear sister, you asked what I am proving. I am not proving anything anymore. I am building something. There is a difference. Arabella." She sealed it and set it by the door and went back to her work. The distinction she had written down was one she had not articulated before that moment. Proving something was a transaction with other people exhausted when it was accepted or rejected. Building something continued regardless of whether anyone was watching. It accumulated. It outlasted the argument that had originally motivated it. Arabella did not need anyone in Chicago to understand that distinction. She needed to understand it herself, and now she did. Reverend Enoch Fairchild came in June. He came alone and tied his horse and knocked, and Arabella let him in and put water on, without asking whether he wanted anything, because she had found over the years that giving people something to do with their hands made the conversations that required courage easier for everyone present. Fairchild sat at the table and looked at his hands and said he had come because he owed her something he had not yet paid. Arabella waited. He said he had told her before the January storm that she was making herself unusual in ways that would cost her, and that appearances mattered, and that she should be more careful about how the community perceived her choices. He said he had been wrong about what her choices meant. He had meant that she was making herself a problem. What she had actually been doing was making herself necessary. He said he had not understood the difference until January showed it to him directly. Arabella set the cups on the table and sat across from him. She said he did not need to say any of this. He said, "Yes, I do." He said it with the quiet certainty of a man who has arrived at a position through genuine reckoning. He said that the next time a woman in this territory tried to do something no one had done before, he wanted this conversation already behind him so that he would know how to respond differently. Arabella looked at him. He was older than he had been before the storm, not in years, but in the way that a significant event ages a person, by settling something that had been unsettled. The man who had come to her door in December of 1883 with concerns about appearances and the judgment of the community was not the same man sitting across from her now. That man had been trying to manage her into a form that the town could accept. This man had stopped managing and started reckoning. She said, "Sit down, Reverend. The coffee is almost ready." Something released in Fairchild's posture. He sat back in the chair in the way that people sit when they have been braced for a response that is not arriving. Arabella poured the coffee and set the cups between them, and for a moment they were simply 2 people in a warm room in the Montana summer, the window showing the benchland in the long light of a June evening, the temperature outside finally doing what it was supposed to do. They talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with the storm or the design. He told her about a family in his congregation whose well had gone alkaline and what the county surveyor had said about finding a new source. She told him about the drainage work she was planning on the west side of the property before the next wet autumn. They talked about the spring planting and the wheat prices and the road conditions between Lewistown and White Sulphur Springs. It was a conversation between two people who had arrived by a difficult road at something resembling ordinary regard. When he left, he paused at the door and said thank you without elaboration, and Arabella nodded and closed the door and stood in the quiet room for a moment, listening to his horse move down the creek road. She thought about what he had said, making herself necessary. She had not set out to be necessary. She had set out to be warm through the winter to solve a problem that the conventional approach had failed to solve once when it mattered most to her personally. The necessity had accumulated around her the way the Tuesday sessions had accumulated without her designing it, because the problem she had solved was not only her problem. It turned out to be everyone's problem. She had simply been the first person in this territory to look at it directly and work through it to its logical conclusion. The summer of 1884 brought 60 acres of wheat in a root cellar dug into the north face of the hillside, the temperature inside holding at 49 degrees through the hottest months. She had lost preserves to summer warmth the previous year. She would not lose them again. Ada rebuilt her cabin that summer with a partially underground storage room attached to the north side. She consulted Arabella 3 times during construction, arriving each time with specific questions rather than general ones. The storage room performed correctly from its first season. Ada reported in October that she had not lost a single jar of preserves to heat. Corwin's structure went up in September on the claim 4 miles west. Arabella rode out twice to look at the foundation work and found it sound. On the second visit, Obadiah Nightingale was there as well, working on the barn framing. He and Arabella spoke about the load distribution on the north wall with the directness of 2 people who both understood the problem. Nightingale pointed out a connection detail he would have handled differently. Arabella agreed with him and told Corwin to make the change. Neither of them said anything about November of 1882. Alonzo Oakenshield came in October with a proposal. He had 3 line shacks on the northern range he intended to rebuild using her design. He named a consulting rate directly a fair number and said he would pay it regardless of whether she agreed with every recommendation. Arabella said she would look at the sites first. Oakenshield said he expected nothing less. She spent 3 days visiting the shack locations, asking the herders detailed questions about how each structure was used and what conditions they regularly worked through. She went home and worked through her notes for a week and sent Oakenshield a written assessment with specific recommendations for each location. She started in November. The rebuilds took 2 winters to complete properly, Arabella riding out at each critical construction stage to verify the work against the specifications she had provided. Each site had its own character, its own bedrock depth and drainage angle, and prevailing wind direction, and adapting the design to each location required the kind of thinking that went past application into genuine understanding of why the principles work, rather than simply how to execute them. She found she enjoyed this part, the problem-solving that was specific to a place that required reading the land and reasoning from what the land offered rather than imposing a fixed template on it. When the 3rd shack was finished and occupied through its first serious cold event, the herder on duty wrote Oakenshield a letter reporting an interior temperature of 57 degrees after the stove had been banked for 4 hours on a night when the outside air reached -22. The man had included a note at the bottom of the letter that said simply, "I used to dread January. I don't anymore." Oakenshield copied both lines into a letter to Arabella with a single annotation beside them, "Your numbers." In the spring of 1885, a man arrived from Helena and introduced himself as a writer for the Helena Independent. He said he was documenting innovative approaches to frontier construction and had been directed to her by 3 separate sources. Arabella told him she did not give interviews. He asked if he could at least see the structure. She said he could see the structure and she would answer specific technical questions, but she would not be quoted on matters of opinion and would not allow her photograph to be taken. He agreed, and she walked him through the site systematically the same way she walked anyone through it who came with a genuine purpose. He was a thorough man, unhurried, who understood that he was looking at something that required actual comprehension rather than colorful description, and his questions reflected this. He asked about the bedrock anchor depth in the drainage design and the chimney configuration. He asked how long the temperature records went back and whether she would allow him to reference the specific numbers from the January storm. She said yes to the numbers and walked him through the daily log from January 23rd through the morning of January 29th, reading the figures aloud while he copied them into his notebook. When the piece appeared the following month, Arabella had Ada read it aloud on a Tuesday evening with the lamp turned up. The article was accurate and measured, quoting Oakenshield and Richter and the Fort Benton surveyor. It described the design principles without sensationalizing them and let the January storm figures speak for themselves, which they did effectively. The final line read, Miss Dunbar declined to be interviewed, saying she had nothing to add that the buildings themselves had not already said. Ada lowered the paper and looked at Arabella across the table. She said that people in 4 counties now knew Arabella's name, that builders were citing Dunbar-style construction in their proposals to clients, that the Territorial Agricultural Extension Office was developing a pamphlet based on her design for distribution to new homesteaders arriving in the spring, a document that would carry her principles into farms and ranches she would never visit in situations she could not anticipate. Ada waited for something more. Arabella said the buildings would outlast the name, that what mattered was not who received credit for the approach, but whether the approach became the way things were built in this territory before the next January, that decided to demonstrate what January in Montana could actually do. She said she had not spent the winter of 1882 digging into a hillside in order to have her name in a newspaper. She had done it because she knew what the alternative looked like. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she said Arabella was the most aggravating, admirable person she had ever known, and that she was very glad Arabella had not gone to Chicago. Arabella said she was fairly glad about that herself. Then in the summer of 1885, Obadiah Nightingale began tearing down his own house. Arabella heard about it from Ada, who had heard it at Calvert's. Ada had been buying cornmeal when the woman behind the counter mentioned that Nightingale had started pulling boards off his own north wall that morning, working alone, making no announcement, and offering no explanation to the 2 men who had stopped to ask what he was doing. He had simply told them he was rebuilding and gone back to work. Arabella was quiet when Ada told her this. She thought about what it meant for a man of Nightingale's reputation to make that choice publicly in a town where he had been the voice of experience and conventional judgment for 30 years. He was not doing it quietly. He was not building on a claim somewhere outside of town where no one would connect it to her design. He was tearing down his own house on the edge of Lewistown in full view of the people who had heard him tell her she was digging her own grave, and he was starting over using the principles he had called worthless. Nightingale had not announced what he was doing or explained himself to anyone beyond that single word, rebuilding. He was simply dismantling what he had built over the years and beginning again, and anyone who had watched Arabella Dunbar work in a hillside could read the shape of the excavation appearing behind his property without being told what it meant. Arabella rode past his land one afternoon in August while traveling to a consultation site. She brought her horse to a walk without making a deliberate decision to slow down. Nightingale was on the barn framing. He looked down and saw her. She looked up and saw him. There was a silence of the kind that exists between 2 people who share a history that neither intends to recite. He nodded. One deliberate movement, not a greeting and not an apology, something more precise than either. The acknowledgement of something that had traveled its full distance and arrived where it was always going to arrive. Arabella nodded back. She rode on. She thought about that moment for a long time afterward. She had imagined in the early months of the construction that vindication would feel like something specific and recognizable. What she found riding away from Nightingale's property in the August afternoon was not triumph. It was not even relief. It was simply the recognition that the argument was finished. Not because she had won it, but because it had resolved itself into something that no longer needed to be argued. Nightingale was building into the hillside because the hillside was where a building should go in this territory. That was the whole of it. February came again in 1886. Arabella was at Calvert's buying supplies when the barometer began to move in the direction she had learned to take seriously. She made her purchases and went to Corwin's workshop on the east side of Lewistown, which had been built as everything Corwin now built to remain warm. The storm that arrived that afternoon was serious weather by any measure Arabella had known outside of January 1884, and it kept her in the workshop overnight and into the following morning. They worked through the evening on Corwin's current projects. 3 new structures in various stages of planning spread across the workshop table in overlapping sheets of survey notes and sketched elevations. One was a challenging site on the east slope of a ridge where the bedrock came up at an angle that would complicate the drainage. Corwin had already worked out 2 possible approaches and wanted Arabella to tell him which one she would choose. She looked at his sketches and asked him 3 questions about the prevailing snowpack direction and the depth of the spring runoff on that particular ridge. He answered them. She said he already knew which approach was correct and that the fact that he was asking her meant he was second-guessing himself for reasons that had nothing to do with the engineering. Corwin looked at his sketches for a moment. Then he said she was right and had put the second approach aside. He had moved past simple application of her design into something more developed, a genuine understanding of the underlying principles that allowed him to reason correctly about situations her original design had not directly addressed. Arabella found this satisfying in a way she had not expected, not because it validated her, but because it meant the knowledge was becoming capable of growing beyond what she alone could carry. Late in the evening, after the storm had settled into its sustained work outside, Corwin looked up from the plans he had been sketching and said that 7 families had come through the storm in Dunbar-style structures. He said that a minister from the north end of the county had told him before moving on that he no longer felt afraid when the weather turned, that he understood his family would be safe. Arabella set down her cup. Corwin said, call it 30 or 35 people, sleeping warm tonight, in structures built on what she had worked out in that hillside in 1882. Arabella looked at the storm moving past the workshop window. She reached into her coat and took out the small current notebook and opened it and wrote the number 7, and beside it the word families, and beside that the number 35. She looked at what she had written. Then she closed the notebook and held it in her hands. She was doing a different kind of arithmetic than the kind that filled the rest of the notebook. Not temperature differentials, not structural load calculations, not wood consumption, tallied against the days remaining in winter. She was counting forward. 7 families this storm. Corwin had consulted on 3 new structures in the past year. The territorial pamphlet had gone out to new homesteaders in the fall. Each structure that got built correctly would stand for 20 years or 30 years or longer if it was maintained, and each family in each structure would understand what had kept them safe, and some of them would carry that understanding to the next place they built, and some of those places would be in territories, and eventually states that Arabella had never visited and might never visit, and the knowledge would continue past the point where any single person could track it or claim it or contain it. She thought about this builder from Great Falls who had wanted to buy the design and sell it at a profit to people who could pay for access. She thought about what that version of events would have produced, which families would have been warm, and which would have spent another January burning through their wood supply and hoping the wind changed before the wood ran out. She had made the right decision in April of 1884 when she told him the value was in the buildings, not in the transaction. She had not known then exactly how right it was. She was beginning to understand it now, sitting in Corwin's workshop with the storm working outside, and 35 people sleeping in warm rooms that would not have existed if she had chosen differently. She had offered the design freely and refused to sell it, and kept the information open to anyone who came with a genuine question, and this was the accumulation of it. 35 people sleeping warm in a Montana February who might not have been otherwise. Knowledge that had left her hands and become part of how things were done in this territory, and it would continue to be done after she was gone. Her grandfather had pressed her hand against a stone wall in Sweden and told her that the earth remembers summer. He had given her that understanding freely, the way he gave everything he knew to anyone who asked, because knowledge kept in a locked room served only the person who held the lock. She had done the same. Corwin was watching her. Arabella looked up from the notebook. She said, "Good," just the word. Corwin had known her long enough to understand what it contained. She stayed on her land along Big Spring Creek for 17 more years, consulting on more than 30 structures across the territory, training Corwin and 2 other builders in the full application of her design principles, corresponding with engineers at the University of Minnesota who had heard about her temperature records and continuing the daily readings that had begun in March of 1883 without a single gap. In those years, she watched the territory become a state, Watch the Judith Basin fill in with farms and ranches and small towns that were beginning to look like they intended to be permanent. Watch the knowledge she had developed move outward from Big Spring Creek through Corwin and the territorial pamphlet and the Helena article, and the conversations that happened between neighbors and between strangers who had heard something useful from someone who had heard it from someone else. She did not track it carefully. It was not the kind of thing that could be tracked. It simply accumulated the way the earth accumulated warmth through a Montana summer, slowly and without drama, until there was enough to last the winter. In 1903, she sold the property to a young couple named Harlan and Celestine Larkmore, who had come from Wisconsin with good questions and the willingness to learn why, rather than just what. Arabella spent 2 full days walking them through everything. The woman Celestine asked on the second day whether Arabella had ever regretted staying. Arabella considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She was quiet for longer than the question seemed to require. She looked around the living quarters that she had built in the winter of 1882 and 1883, at the stone-faced walls and the stove that had run for 20 years, and the 2 glass windows she had ordered from Fort Benton, because she had calculated that the cost of glass was less than the cost of the heat she would lose through a poorly insulated opening. She had replaced the linseed putty twice. She had repointed the interior clay every 3 years, exactly as she had predicted when she bought the building. She had repaired the north wall of the barn after the January storm and reinforced the connection points on the east face in 1891, when a late-season ice storm demonstrated a load distribution problem she had not anticipated. She had learned something from every repair. She said no. She said she had been afraid for a long time in ways she had never entirely explained to anyone, and that the fear had been correct about the size of the choice she was making. It was that large. It was that irreversible. What the fear had been wrong about was the outcome. She said, build it correctly. That is the only instruction that matters. Everything else follows from that. She moved to Ada's house that afternoon and did not turn to look back at the hillside as she drove away. She had said everything she needed to say to it over 21 years of daily measurements, and 2 winters of keeping people alive inside it, and hundreds of conversations with people who had come to learn what it had to teach. There was nothing left to add. She died in March of 1909 in the room with the good morning light in Ada's house near the church. Ada was with her. They had lived together for 6 years by then and had developed the comfortable routine of 2 women who had each lost what they expected to build their lives around and had built something different instead. Arabella's death was quiet, in keeping with the way she had lived without drama at the end of a thing that had been completed. The obituary in the Lewistown paper noted that structures built according to her principles continued to serve families throughout the state, and called her practical wisdom and generous spirit a testament to the best qualities of the frontier generation. What the obituary could not capture was the arithmetic. In the winter of 1907, 2 years before Arabella died, the State Agricultural Office had counted 43 earth-integrated structures in the Judith Basin alone, with more under construction and more planned. Corwin had trained 3 apprentices who had spread across 4 states. The Larkmores had a daughter who would grow up in the house along Big Spring Creek and learn its principles and take them to Oregon when she moved west in 1921 and build into a hillside outside Portland, because her mother had told her it was the right way to build, and her mother had learned it from the woman who had figured it out alone in a Montana winter, because she had trusted what her grandfather told her and what the land showed her and what the numbers confirmed every morning when she opened her notebook and read the temperature and wrote it down. The thermometer in the original living quarters read 61 degrees on a January morning in 1908, when the outside air was 9 below zero. The stove had not been lit since the previous evening. The earth held what it had accumulated and released it slowly and steadily into the enclosed space, as it had held and released for every year of the 25 since Arabella Dunbar first understood that this was what the earth could do if a person was willing to trust it. She had been willing to trust what she knew, to act on it alone, to carry it through the years until it became part of the ground itself. That was the whole of it. That was enough.